pretty close to the spot where I recorded a video about 2 years ago about my son getting cancer and sharing some of my struggles with that emotionally, about how angry I was at God, about the problem of evil in general, and just sharing some of that circumstance. So I think it's time for an update. My son is doing great. He is fully recovered. It looks like the specific cancer which he had, which was infantile fibrosarcoma, is in full remission, and it's the kind of cancer that has a very low probability of coming back. So we're in the clear. And now, between telling you the happy ending and telling you a little bit about that beginning, I'd like to share some of the miracles along the way, some of the things that we experienced, and also talk about a style of miracle that I like to call the best worst case scenario. And I'll be using my son's cancer as an example of that, kind of the leading example. But I also want to share another one which affected me, and also another one which affected my other son. This is a pattern. So with my 2-year-old, who was an infant at the time that I made that previous video, we found the lump on his ankle, and it was massive. We went to a couple specialists. At first we thought it was just a cyst, the kind of thing that goes away naturally. And eventually, after a biopsy, we confirmed that it was cancer, and that it was malignant, and that it was growing, and that it was a threat to him. So that was horrifying and terrifying, and that's when I recorded the previous video. After that point, they finally were able to figure out what type of cancer it was shortly thereafter. They identified it as infantile fibrosarcoma, which turns out to be one of the easiest cancers to treat, with a very high success rate of survivability. And they also determined that if they were to remove it surgically, they might permanently damage his foot, but they were pretty sure they could save his life. And then, shortly after getting that good news, we got the next level of good news, which was that there is a gene therapy treatment available for him specifically, because they sequenced the entire genome of his tumor and identified a specific gene that they could target. So they gave him a special drug called loritractinib, which is still in medical trials, and we got on one of those medical trials, so the expenses were covered for this as part of the study. And we gave him this drug in his bottle, and it wasn't even chemo. It was a drug that attacked the specific gene on the tumor, passed right through my little boy's system, and he didn't even know it was there. We just slipped it into his bottle with his formula and watched the tumor disappear to nothing over the course of about 1.5 years. And now we're just doing follow-up studies and follow-up MRIs to confirm that. Now, that is miraculous. It is the worst scenario ever to find out that your child has cancer, but we got the best worst case scenario. The blow was cushioned by the fact that it was a treatable cancer, by the fact that there was a new drug on the market, that it wasn't technically on the market, and so we were able to get it at reduced cost, at no cost. And that's amazing. And then at the time, I was working for Monticello College, which was highly, non-traditional work. And because of that, I was able to take time off every week at first to drive him the 5 hours up to Primary Children's Hospital in Salt Lake City. And, get him the care he needed and be there for my little boy. And that circumstance of my employment allowed for that, which was another part of that miracle. So he's now fine. He is the sweetest, most wonderful, cutest little boy you've ever seen in your life. And the only thing he has is a couple of scars that he will learn the stories about when he's much older. And know that without the memory of any sort of chemo or horrific surgery or any of that stuff, he'll be there. And there's a couple funny stories I'd love to share from that time period. He has the perfect personality for that kind of challenge. And part of that is conditioning, that we were just in hospitals a lot, but he's just so open and sweet and accepting. There's a bunch of different archetypes of a child, right? There's the little hellion, and then there's the sweet, docile child that submits willingly to the will of the father, that sort of thing. And my little boy is very much of that latter type. A couple weeks ago, no, this would have been about a month ago, I told him, it's time to go to the doctor, and we were about to drive the 4 hours off to Primary Children's for one of these MRI checkups. And he said, okay, I get my shoes. And he's 2. And I said the word doctor, and he just said, okay, and just came along with me. And his pain tolerance and his sweetness are just wonderful. There was one time, we've had to take blood samples every time we go in. And this is one of my favorite stories. He would have been 8 months old at the time, and I had him kind of tucked in my arm with his arm propped out so that the phlebotomist could take some blood. And I wedged his other arm kind of behind my back, and I had his bottle in his mouth so that, so he wouldn't cry too much. And he had his bottle in his mouth, he was looking left, looking right, he knew something was up. And the phlebotomist sticks the needle in his arm, and he didn't cry. He just went, his disposition was beautifully matched to this challenge. Now, I'd like to contrast that briefly with my other son, my firstborn son, who, when he was 9 months old, had hydrocephalus, which is a brain condition where the fluid in your brain doesn't drain. And it started swelling and trying to crack his skull open and crushing his brain from the inside. And we didn't identify it early enough. And, we had to get life-flighted to Primary Children's Hospital, and it was in the middle of the night, and it was absolutely terrifying. And I heard a little voice in my head that said, if I take him, will you be okay? And I said, yes, but I'd really rather you didn't. My wife had one at about the same time, similar impression. And at 2 in the morning, I'm rushing him to the emergency room. The emergency room does a CT scan and identifies that his brain is about to explode, pretty much. And they call for a life flight helicopter. They take us again to Primary Children's. And we get there, and the pediatrician is desperately trying to keep him alive, trying to keep his heart rate stable as he goes between super low heart rate, which they decided was more dangerous, and super high heart rate. So we're trying to keep him stimulated in order to keep him alive. And then the neurosurgeon on call comes in, takes one look at the CT scan, and says, in about this voice, oh, I know how to fix that. And turns out that this particular neurosurgeon is the national chair for an organization dedicated to studying my boy's specific condition. Right place, right time. Best, worst case scenario. Worst case scenario to find out that your little boy is having that horrific health struggle, is about to die. And it turned out best possible scenario that we were right next to the right hospital at the right time. Again, my job had taken me to where we were right next to a hospital with a landing pad, right next to Primary Children's. So, that's another one of those stories. Now, because of that brain surgery that he had to undergo, and because of the damage that the hydrocephalus did, he has had a really hard time learning how to use the right side of his body. He's basically had the symptoms of kind of cerebral palsy. And, he was 3 before he learned how to walk. And that was a miracle, that he was able to use his right leg enough to walk. And his right hand has had a really hard time. And, what kind of personality would be perfect to endure that kind of challenge? Unending, stubborn, independent will. And that's exactly what he has. The brain damage that he sustained didn't affect his language processing centers of his brain. It didn't affect his higher reasoning at all. It didn't affect his prefrontal cortex at all. So his decision making is fine. It was literally the gross motor development on the right side of his body. Best, worst case scenario. And he's stubborn. He's amazingly stubborn. He is stubborn as a mule and independent spirited. And so I will say, son, do you want me to help you tie your shoes? And he will say, no, I do it myself. And he will fight and sit and force himself to do things that are hard, which is perfect for a little boy who is struggling to learn how to use his body, to be disciplined and stubborn about wanting to do things himself so that he can gain that independence that he sees his siblings have. That's amazing. I'll share one more best worst case scenario. I had an experience in 2016 where I was riding my motorcycle, and I had just had a number of conversations with God about what I wanted to do with my life. I had been praying and asking, what should I do with my life? And God gave me this very uncomfortable response. I had a very clear impression of, what do you want? And I said, what do you want me to want? And he said, you're not getting out of it that easy. And I really thought about it, and I decided I want a farm. I want a small farm. I want to raise my family. I want to tinker with inventions and 3D printers and that kind of stuff. And that's what I want, is some independence. And that's not where I was going. At the time, I was shooting for a PhD in philosophy. I just barely gotten into a program that would let me get a second bachelor's at the University of Utah and then work my way into a PhD program. And, you know, very shortly thereafter, some opportunities were presented themselves in a very unusual way. I got in a motorcycle accident right after quitting my job teaching high school. And, you know, it snapped both of my legs. And that's a worst case scenario. I T-boned a guy at 50 miles an hour. I should be dead. A guy pulled in front of me at the worst possible moment, and there was nothing I could do to prevent the crash. I had a split second of realizing what was about to happen. I had a split second decision. Do I try to swerve right and end up underneath the guy? Do I swerve left and clip his bumper and then go into a slide and turn into a hamburger? Or do I slam on my brakes and hope and pray? So I slammed on my brakes and I rammed him at 50 miles an hour. My body went flying. Next thing I knew, I was lying on my side and my right leg was 3 inches shorter than my left. My knee was closer to me. And I was numb on my thigh and realized I'd broken my femur. So I called my wife. She was able to get there on scene about the same time the paramedics did. Paramedics there were there fast. They were able to give me drugs for the pain before the shock fully wore off. And then they took me 3 minutes to the best trauma center in Salt Lake City, which has some of the best trauma centers in the world. And the worst part of that whole experience was actually my radiologist. I was protected. I survived. I had no road rash, except for a little scuff on my elbow. And I mean like a little scrape, like tripping in your kitchen kind of scrape. And I had snapped my right femur into 3 pieces. I had snapped my left leg in a couple places. But the type of crash I had very frequently will slice your femoral artery from the inside with your bone shards. Didn't do that. Didn't cause a lot of damage of that kind. It literally just snapped the bones. Gave me a little nerve damage in the left foot. And, you know, as mad as I was about that and as hurt as I was about that, the insurance money from that allowed me to go to law school. And during the time that I was broken, I had a chance to experience the life of my father-in-law to a great degree. He lives in a wheelchair, has nerve damage in his feet. And I was able to experience the thought process that goes into being in a wheelchair for, you know, a couple months. And to think about that, when you are invited someplace, you instantly see the floor plan in your head and you say, sorry, I can't make it. You've got 2 steps up to the front door. Best worst case scenario. Worst case scenario, to get in a motorcycle wreck that should kill you. I mean, that's horrible. Don't do that. But to survive with no road rash, no brain damage, no pelvis damage, and be picked up with the police and the paramedics within minutes of where you are and take you to one of the best trauma centers in the country, and then within minutes. Best worst case scenario. I wanted to share that as a pattern, as an idea for a flavor of miracle. One of the things that's frustrating about miracles, the word miracle and wonder have the same root idea, even though one's Germanic and one is Latin. Both are things that are worth looking at. A miracle is a, look at this, isn't that interesting? And that, in one sense, every miracle is just a thing that happened. And in order to tell that it's a miracle, I guess you would have to compare it to a thing that didn't happen, which by definition didn't happen. So it really takes the right kind of vision, the right kind of mira, the right kind of looking to see a miracle. And this is one flavor of miracle that I have witnessed in my life, is the best worst case scenario. And you know, in the previous video I talked a little bit about the reasons for pain, and I won't elaborate further on that here. But I am grateful that I experienced these miracles. And I'll close that. I have witnessed, I have seen, miracle, look at, I've seen stuff that is miraculous in my life. And those are just 3 specifically medical examples. I'm not going to get into job applications and, you know, sudden bursts of inspiration and the rest. At least not here, not now. I hope this finds you well. And I hope you see miracles in your life.